Welcome to another online tutorial. We're going to be talking about dominant and recessive genes, or as we discussed in one of our previous video, dominant or recessive alleles. Okay, and touch on some of these new words that you may have seen, but maybe not too sure about. Homozygous and heterozygous. What does it mean? Well, we're going to get into that. So thinking back to our previous video, we talked about there being different versions of the same gene. Okay, and we used the example of eye color, blue and brown, and those being the genes that coded for such, being different versions of the same gene, and we called them alleles. Well, today we're going to be dealing with earlobes, very exciting, specifically detached or attached earlobes. Those alleles and how they express themselves, if they're dominant or recessive, what that even means, okay, as well as these words here, homozygous and heterozygous, how we use those and what they mean. Let's get into it. So, thinking back, in our last video, we talked about there being these pairs of chromosomes that had corresponding information on them. Okay, and I'm going to draw 3 pairs. You're going to have to deal with the odd spacing and terrible picture quality. Ooh. Trying to reach around the camera. So, if we imagine that all these genes, and these are for 3 different individuals, all have a corresponding, all these chromosomes have a corresponding gene in a similar section. Okay, this is individual 1, individual 2, and individual 3. Okay, so for 1, we're going to say that they have 1 dominant gene, 1 recessive gene. For 2, we're going to say they have both dominant genes, and I'm just going to colour in them to mark that. Or 3, that they have both recessive genes. Now, because we're talking about earlobes, we're going to use E to denote our allele, or our gene. And for our dominant gene, or our dominant allele, we're going to use a capital. And for our recessive, we're going to use a lowercase. So if I was to write out the genotype underneath this, I would have big E, little e, big E, big E, little e, little e. Okay. Now, we can actually name this. Alright? So when we have 1 dominant and 1 recessive allele, we call this heterozygous. Okay. When we have 2 dominant alleles, or 2 dominant genes, so both our genes are the dominant variety, we call this homozygous. Now, because it's homozygous and they're both dominant, we're going to say homozygous dominant. Okay. Fairly simple. Here we have again 2 of the same type of allele, but this time they're both recessive. So we're going to again call it homozygous. But we're going to call it homozygous recessive. So, just to cover that, thinking back to our previous video, we said that our chromosomes come in these pairs, okay, these homologous pairs, where they have corresponding sets of DNA. And those corresponding sections of DNA, those genes, code for similar things in similar places, and you can have different versions, which we call alleles. Okay. Now, we've got 3 examples here, 3 different individuals, okay, thinking about the gene that controls whether the earlobe is attached or detached. We've got heterozygous, we've got 1 dominant, 1 recessive, okay, homozygous, dominant, we've got 2 dominant, homozygous, recessive, we've got 2 recessive. And we're just going to remember that capital equals dominant, okay, and lowercase equals recessive. So if you see an allele denoted in either of these ways, you can tell if it's dominant or recessive allele off the bat, just based on if it's written as a capital or if it's written as a lowercase, which would be recessive. Okay, so we have our genotypes. We have our heterozygous, our homozygous dominant, and our homozygous recessive. What does it mean if you actually have these genotypes? So we're going to draw up a quick little table here and show that. So we're going to have our genotype. Okay. and that's going to be our we'll start off with heterozygous, big E, little e. We'll go with our homozygous dominant, big E, and our homozygous recessive, little e, little e. Okay, and we've got the same names here, so I'm not going to write them underneath. Just remember that if you've got both, it's hetero. If you've got the same, it's homo. And if it's dominant, you'd say homozygous dominant. If it's recessive, you'd say homozygous recessive. Okay, so that's our genotype. Again, thinking back to our previous video, when you have a genotype, these genes are going to express themselves physically, and you will get a phenotype. I don't know why I'm writing cursive sometimes and not the other time. Whew. That's alright. Alright, so for us, when we see a dominant gene, okay, we're going to know, dominant allele, we're going to know that that is going to be expressed. Okay, when we see a recessive, they're not. Now, before we were talking about our big E equaling our dominant trait, which is our detached earlobes. Oh, that's a weird way of spelling ear. So Daisy, earlobes. And our little ear, our recessive, which is attached earlobes. Oh, got attached here wrong. Got a little H in there. Oh. Attached earlobes. So we've got detached with big E, attached with little e. So in our homozygous dominant, we can see we're only going to have detached, so it's going to be pretty easy. We're going to know we're going to have detached earlobes. In our homozygous recessive, we've only got the genes for attached, so we know we're going to have attached earlobes. But what about when we get our heterozygous? Well, because we have the dominant gene, or our dominant allele, we're going to express whatever this gene is. So for our phenotype, we would get detached earlobes. And I'm going to try to draw a detached earlobe here. Okay, on the side of someone's head. Okay, let's just do a quick one down. Okay, same for our big E. We've got the dominant gene, or dominant allele twice, so we know we're going to have detached earlobes. So, to draw my little detached earlobe. Okay, kind of looks a bit like a butterfly, but that's alright. And then when we get our homozygous recessive, we get our attached earlobes. So if I draw that on, I'm going to get my earlobe without the lobe really coming off, and it's going to attach into the head, or attach to the head, sorry. Okay, no little lobe poking out. Now I know this isn't the best drawing, but I'm a science teacher, not an art teacher, so you will have to forgive me. So what can we take away from this? Okay, we can take away that if the dominant gene, or allele, present, okay, it will be expressed. So if we have the dominant gene, like we do for our heterozygous or for our homozygous dominant, you will get the dominant gene expressed in the phenotype. So we'll get detached earlobes. Okay. Now for our or our homozygous recessive, okay, we don't. So if homozygous recessive, oh, that's some weird spelling over there. Recessive to it's in an IV. So if a homozygous recessive, sorry, we are going to express the recessive trait. So far today we've talked about dominant and recessive alleles. We talked about them being different versions of a gene in a previous video. Now we talked about how one will be expressed over the other. That's our dominant allele, and we denote that with a capital. We also have our lowercase allele, which can be present but not expressed. Our recessive allele, which we denote with a lowercase, which can be present but not expressed. Through our example of heterozygous, they have the dominant and the recessive allele, but only the dominant is shown in the phenotype. And if you have homozygous recessive, only the homozygous recessive genes, only the lowercase, the recessive genes present, then you're going to get the recessive trait. And this kind of looks almost like a nose, so I do really apologize for that drawing. But our main takeaways being, if the dominant allele is present, it will be expressed. If no dominant allele is present, like with our homozygous recessive, we will get our recessive trait expressed. Okay. So what does homozygous mean? It means we have two of the same gene or allele in our genotype. Heterozygous meaning we have different versions present. Okay. Hopefully that's helpful explaining some of this genetics to your team. Get out there, get into it, and have fun.